As we have been reporting, Russians are voting in a general election. Polls will be open for the next 3 days. The vote is happening against the backdrop of Russia's war in Ukraine and Putin's crackdown on his critics. Just weeks ago, opposition leader Alexei Navalny died suddenly in prison. Another opposition politician and journalist, Vladimir Kara-Murza, was arrested in Moscow in April of 2022. He was charged with high treason and spreading false information after he publicly denounced Putin for the war in Ukraine. We spoke to Kara-Murza just a few weeks before his arrest. Take a listen to what he told our Suhana Marchand when asked if he was worried about speaking out.
Is this a dangerous interview for you to do?
Well, they tried to kill me twice. I guess safety is not a notion that we associate with being in opposition here in Russia. But you know what? It is our country too, not just Putin's. We care about the future of our country. And we know there are many, many Russians around this country who share our view. And for their sake, we have to continue our work.
Vladimir Kara-Murza has since been sentenced to 25 years in prison. His supporters say Kara-Murza's health is failing after 2 poisoning attempts in 2015 and 2017. He is one of just many Democratic critics who have been jailed by Putin for voicing their opinions. For more on this, we have reached the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, Bill Browder. He's in London today. He's also the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. And also joining us from Washington is Vladimir Kara-Murza's wife, Evgenia Kara-Murza. She is the advocacy director for the Free Russia Foundation. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Bill, I'm going to start with you here, if that's okay, because we do want to start with some of what we have been seeing already today out of Russia with regards to an election, of course, if you can call it that, because there are reports, and you can see some video here that we have, of paint in some cases being poured into ballot boxes. In other cases, like you're looking at here, it would appear that people are setting fire to those ballot boxes. There's no real opposition allowed, no political accountability by rulers. What do you make of this? What is your reaction to this? And will this sort of resistance, will it achieve anything in your view?
Well, the first thing we need to say is that to even call it an election is an insult to the word election. Putin has killed, imprisoned, or exiled every person who is in any way in competition to him. He has gone around and terrorized the people of his country. You can't say a word about him without losing your job, losing your freedom. And so what we have right now is a full-on totalitarian regime. This sort of spectacle that they're putting on over the next 3 days is a complete fake. There's nothing legitimate about it from start to finish. And he's going to try to use it to then say, look, we have a democracy in our country and there's a competition to be president when in fact there's no such thing.
Evgenia, I want to bring you in here as well. Thank you again for joining us. I can only imagine what the past couple of years have been like. Your husband has been imprisoned for nearly 2 years now. When was the last time that you heard from him?
We sometimes have the possibility to communicate through letters that, of course, go through censorship because they are sent through the prison mail system. The last time we had a phone call from Vladimir was last December, and that was a 15-minute phone call. We have 3 kids, so 5 minutes per kid. And I was there with a timer, literally timing their time, because I could not allow any one of them to talk to their daddy for more than 5 minutes. And of course, I didn't talk to him myself because I didn't want to take that time away from the kids. And Vladimir is not the only one in such conditions. There are hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners in Russia, and all of those people have fiercely and courageously stood up to the regime and said no to its policies, both domestic and its foreign aggression against Ukraine. And I believe that the stories of these people need to be known. Their names need to be known because they are also Russia. These are the faces of a different Russia, a democratic Russia, a normal country that would live respecting the rights and freedoms of its own citizens, and that would live in peace with its neighbors. And I believe that this is the Russia that we should strive for. And I call for solidarity and support of the free world with these people who represent that different Russia.
Do we have any idea at this point how he is coping, Evgenia, mentally, emotionally, physically?
Well, after the murder of Alexei Navalny, he participated in yet another hearing on his case and was able to address the audience shortly through a video. And he said that although he was absolutely devastated by this new political assassination in our country, and this is, of course, not the first one carried out by the Russian authorities, carried out by FSB services, but he called on everyone to not give up. And he said that this is exactly what they would expect of us, to give up, to give in to intimidation, to give in to this constant pressure. And he called on us to continue fighting with all we've got, because this is what we owe to our fallen comrades, to continue fighting against this regime until it collapses.
And Bill, I have to imagine that you are also going to be thinking quite a bit about Vladimir over the next 3 days as we watch what is happening underway in Russia as Vladimir Kara-Murza continues to be in prison, because his testimony was very important in the passage of the Magnitsky Act in several countries, including here in Canada. Tell us a little bit briefly here about the act, and can you also help us understand why Vladimir Kara-Murza's role in standing up against Putin is so important?
So the origin of the Magnitsky Act was that my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, uncovered a massive Putin-connected corruption scheme. He exposed it, and he was tortured and killed in prison for doing that. And so we then started to fight for sanctions, to freeze the assets and ban the visas of the crooks in the Putin regime. And as I started to go around to do that, one of the big questions was, do the Russian people support this? And one of the most important people to show up to answer that question was Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir represented the people of Russia in hearings in the Canadian Parliament and the US Congress and various other parliaments around the world, and explained to all the politicians that the Russian people don't want Putin and his cronies to be stealing and killing the way they're doing, and that the Magnitsky Act was a very powerful and important piece of legislation to stop that. And his voice was extremely powerful. His voice was very charismatic. And between our two testimonies, there are 35 countries in the world that have Magnitsky Acts. And Vladimir Putin hates this Magnitsky Act more than anything because it puts his own personal fortune at risk. And so in retaliation for the passage of the Magnitsky Act, he poisoned Vladimir not once, but twice, nearly killed him twice. And when Vladimir came back to Russia after the war started to protest the war, and he went on CNN and called Putin a war criminal and a murderer, he was then arrested and then sentenced to 25 years, which is the longest prison sentence for any political prisoner in Russia. And I believe, and I think Vladimir believes this as well, that this was a major part of the severity of the sentence was because of this work that he and I did together on the Magnitsky Act. And so at this point, he is the most, after Alexei Navalny, he is now the most important political prisoner in Russia. And as you mentioned earlier, he is at a high risk of dying because of the health conditions and the health deterioration from this terrible poison that they subjected him to, and the harsh conditions they're subjecting him to right now in solitary confinement in a Siberian prison. And so I'm doing everything I can, and I'm working with the Evgenia and everyone else in trying to find a way to get him out of prison so that we can save his life.
And Evgenia, of course, with voting now underway in Russia and on the heels of Alexei Navalny's death a few weeks ago, are you at all hopeful one day that Vladimir Putin will be challenged at some point in a legitimate democratic process?
I do want to see Vladimir Putin on trial and spending the rest of his life behind bars for all the crimes that he has committed over the years, over a quarter of a century of his rule. As to this process that is taking place today in Russia, I believe that Vladimir Putin is being challenged consistently. This is why the prosecutor's office already said, with regard to that rally that we're planning tomorrow, we're calling on everyone to come to the polling stations at noon. So the prosecutor's office already declared that voting at noon would be seen as participation in an unauthorized rally which would also mean criminal prosecution for all those who would dare do this. So this shows that despite all the measures that the regime is using to create this image of universal support for Vladimir Putin and for the war in Ukraine, Russian people are looking for every single opportunity to say no in any way possible. Like the recent very short-lived campaign of Boris Nadezhdin showed, when tens of thousands of Russian citizens stood in long lines, in low winter temperatures to sign petitions for Nadezhdin, for his candidature in the election, because he was the only one running on an anti-war platform. And of course, he was not registered, which should not be a surprise, because again, even such a candidate as Nadezhdin, who is not a very strong opposition leader, and he's very careful even in his wording, and he's not seen as anyone truly like a figure of opposition. But people were there to not really sign petitions for his candidature, but to sign petitions against the war. And this is important. And this is why Vladimir Putin is using such harsh measures with regard to any dissent in the country, because he very much relies on that image of universal support that he tries to create through blunt force, through intimidation, through repression, and through, murder of his political opponents.
And Bill, to bring it back here once again to Vladimir Kara-Murza, of course, he is a Russian and a British national. He also has honorary Canadian citizenship. We reached out to Canadian federal officials looking for any information about what they know about how he's doing. We have not heard back. But what would your message be to Canadian officials, American, British officials, about what could possibly happen here to Vladimir Kara-Murza if he is not freed?
My message is very clear that after Alexei Navalny, Vladimir is the next most important target. And as Evgenia has just said, Putin can't tolerate any type of resistance, opposition. And so he's not going to survive if we don't get him out. And I think it's very important for everybody to understand that, while we're doing everything we can to help Ukraine fight off Putin and his murderous army, we should do everything we can to help the Russians inside Russia who are standing up to Putin. And of course, Vladimir is the most important one at this point.
And Evgenia, just a final question here to you as well. Sensitive, a difficult question as well. As you were saying the last time you spoke with them, your three children each had 5 minutes each timed to speak with your husband, to speak with their father. What has this been like for you? What are your worst fears at this point?
I don't give in to fear. Honestly, I think it's a luxury. And I think that I live by something that Winston Churchill said once. He said that if you're going through hell, keep going. And this is exactly what I've been doing for the past, not just 2 years, but this like the war in Ukraine that really began with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. This hell that our family has been going through began in 2015 with the first poisoning, when I first saw my husband in intensive care units covered in tubes because none of his organs worked and he was in a coma. That was the first time. That was the second time. And now we have this 25-year prison sentence. So this inhumane regime has to be stopped. The only way for that continent to live in peace and prosperity is for the regime of Vladimir Putin to be gone and for Russians to be given yet another opportunity to build a democracy in our country. A democratic Russia is the only guarantee of peace and stability on that continent. And for as long as Vladimir Putin's regime is allowed to survive, warmongering will continue and repression in the country will continue. And those two things go hand in hand, like two sides of the same coin. They're always interconnected in Russia. Internal repression always leads to more and more external aggression. And I think that the terrible aggression against Ukraine has shown up to the world. And I think that the way repression, the level of repression, the degree of repression is growing inside Russia has shown it to the world. This regime has got to be stopped. And the first, I think, important step in this direction would be for the free world to finally call Putin for what he is a usurper and a dictator, not a legitimate president. Vladimir Putin is not a legitimate president, and this so-called election has nothing to do with the process that is called election in any normal democracy.
I can't thank you both enough for joining us today to speak about this. We really do appreciate this. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Was the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, Bill Browder, for us in London, and then Vladimir Kara-Murza's wife, and the advocacy director for the Free Russia Foundation, Evgenia Kara-Murza, joining us there in Washington.